The gavel came down at 11:14 in the morning. $60. Sold. Wendell Pruett laughed loud enough that 3 people near the folding chairs turned around. $60 for a hole in the wall, he said to nobody and everybody. Woman could have bought a used refrigerator. Ruth Calloway did not look at him. She wrote her name on the receipt, folded it once, and put it in the pocket of her coat. The vault door was 7 feet tall and painted the gray of an old Navy ship, chipped down to rust along the hinges. 410 pounds, the auctioneer's man guessed, though nobody had a scale big enough to prove it. The combination dial had frozen at the number 6. Nobody else in Colby County had noticed the second keyhole, small as a shirt button, hidden under the handle casting. Ruth had. She had spent 31 years behind a teller's window, and she knew a vault the way some men know a horse. It was the 9th of April, 1971. Millhaven, Nebraska. The temperature sat at 41 degrees under a sky the color of dishwater, and the wind came off the empty fields smelling like wet ash from somebody's early burn pile. 40, maybe 50 people stood in the gravel lot of the First Agricultural Bank of Millhaven, watching the county sell off what was left of a building that had closed its doors 9 years before. Ruth was 63 years old, 5'2", built thin through the shoulders and thick through the hands. She wore a brown wool coat with a mended tear at the left elbow and rubber boots 2 sizes too big. Her husband's, dead 6 years now. Her eyes were pale gray, the color of the vault door itself, and she had a habit of running her thumb along her opposite palm when she was thinking, feeling for a callus that had never quite gone away. She had grown up on Larrabee Street, watching her father repair adding machines in the back room of Hutchins Hardware, and by 9 years old, she could name every gear inside a mechanical lock. When the bank hired her in 1940, the manager gave her the teller window because her handwriting was neat. What he never knew, because she never told him, was that she had also memorized the manufacturer's stamps on every vault and lockbox that came through that building, the way another woman might memorize hymns. A vault does not keep secrets, she liked to say, though she had said it to almost no one in 20 years. It keeps promises. Somebody's, anyway. Nobody paid much for that kind of knowledge anymore. Banks were putting in electronic systems now, keypads with blinking lights, and the trade she had built her patience on was going the way of the telegraph key. She kept at it anyway, buying up old bank fixtures at county auctions for $30, $40 a time, restoring what she could, selling what she couldn't to museums 2 counties over. It did not pay well. It never had. Her father used to say a lock only ever asked one question, and it would keep asking until somebody answered it right. Ruth had believed that since she was 9 years old, watching him work a jammed adding machine by lamplight instead of forcing it open with a screwdriver the way a lazier man might have. He never raised his voice at a stuck gear. He talked to it low the way a man talks to a spooked horse, and eventually it always gave. She had carried that lesson into every vault she'd ever opened since, 26 of them by her own count, kept in a spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer along with the date, the town, and what she'd found. Her hands told the story her mouth never did. The knuckles had swollen past straight years ago, arthritis working its slow claim on fingers that had spent 3 decades sorting bills and counting coin. Under her nails, most days, was a fine gray grid of rust and metal polish that no amount of scrubbing fully lifted. She wore her wedding ring on a chain around her neck now instead of her finger, since the joint had grown too stiff to hold it, and she touched it sometimes without noticing she'd done it. Wendell Pruett had driven up from Lincoln in a new Cadillac the color of a robin's egg, wearing a navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut paper, with a gold watch that caught the gray light every time he lifted his arm to point at something. He was 44, heavy-set, with a voice built for filling rooms. He worked for the state as a bank examiner, and he had come to Millhaven not for the auction, but for the paperwork, the kind of man who found reasons to be seen wherever a crowd had already gathered. $60, he said again, louder this time, walking a slow circle around Ruth like he was inspecting livestock. Ma'am, I've closed out 4 failed banks in this district. I know what's behind those doors. Dust. Mouse nests. A ledger nobody wants. The crowd laughed, not because it was funny, but because Pruett laughed first, and a crowd laughs the way water runs downhill. Somebody near the coffee table hollered, She could have got 2 flat tires and a toaster for that. More laughing. Ruth said nothing. She did not answer him, then or after. She walked to her truck, a 1958 Ford with a bad heater, and backed it up to the loading ramp the county men had built out of 2x10s. Now, if you have ever seen a man who knew exactly what he was doing get laughed out of a room by a man who did not, subscribe to this channel. Because the people who stay for stories like Ruth Calloway's are exactly who Forgotten Federal Buildings was built for. The first agricultural bank of Millhaven had gone up in the spring of 1919, built from limestone hauled in by rail from a quarry near Beatrice. It was meant to be the anchor of a town that never quite arrived at the size its founders had planned for. By 1951, it was still standing, still solvent, still trusted enough that families in 3 townships kept their savings and their deeds and their war bonds behind that gray steel door. That was the year Corporal Daniel Voss came home on a 10-day leave from Korea, walked into that bank on a Tuesday morning, and rented a safe deposit box under his own name and his sister's. Nobody at the bank thought much of it. Soldiers did that kind of thing before shipping back out. The tellers used to say, the same way a man leave his watch with someone he trusts before he goes into water he isn't sure of. Daniel Voss did not come home again. He was killed outside a hill the maps called nothing but a number in November of 1951, 7 months after he stood at that counter. His box sat behind the vault door for 20 years, through rent notices nobody paid, because nobody came to pay them, through the bank's slow decline, through its closing in 1962, through 9 years of empty rooms and pigeons in the rafters. Boxes like his, unclaimed and unpaid, were supposed to go to the state. This one, filed wrong or forgotten right, never did. Ruth had grown up 2 streets from the Voss place. She remembered Daniel as a lanky boy who fixed his own bicycle chain rather than ask his father for a new one, quiet the way boys who work with their hands often are, embarrassed by praise. She had not thought of him in years. Standing at that auction, running her thumb over her palm, she thought of him now. The bank itself had survived the Depression by a margin so thin the manager at the time, a man named Aldous Rourke, kept the doors open only by mortgaging his own house against the vault's contents, a fact recorded nowhere but in a single ledger Ruth had once found water-damaged in a filing cabinet. It survived a fire in 1938 that took the roof off the feed store next door, but left the limestone walls untouched, black smoke stains still visible over the east windows the day of the auction. Millhaven had never been a large town, never more than 900 people at its peak in 1950, and the bank had been, for most of its life, the only building in the county with a door that locked in a way nobody could argue with. That was why families trusted it with things they could not replace. A vault does not care whose name is on the account. It only cares that the combination is turned the right number of times, in the right direction, by someone who intends to come back. The drive home took 19 miles at 28 miles an hour, the truck bad springs groaning every time the road dipped, rain starting light around the halfway mark, and Ruth working the wipers by hand because the motor had quit in 1968 and she'd never gotten around to it. Word beat her home anyway. By the time she pulled into her yard, her neighbor Delbert Finn was already leaning on his fence. "Here you bought yourself a chunk of the old bank," he said. "Wendell Pruett's, telling it around town, you paid $60 for scrap metal." "I heard him the first time," Ruth said, and backed the truck toward the garage. Getting the door off the truck bed took 2 come-alongs, a length of chain, and 40 minutes of patient work, Ruth talking to the steel the whole time the way she talked to anything stubborn. She braced a plank ramp against the tailgate, walked the door down an inch at a time, her boots slipping once on the wet gravel, catching herself against the fender before it went further. By 4 in the afternoon, it stood upright in her garage, propped against a workbench built from a church pew, under a single bare bulb she'd wired herself in 1959. She ate supper first, cold ham and bread standing at the counter, because she had learned a long time ago that hungry hands make careless mistakes. The rain had thickened by then, drumming steady on the tin roof, and the garage smelled of motor oil and damp with the way it always did in wet weather. Delbert's porch light was already on across the fence when she looked out, and she guessed by then half the town had heard some version of the story, most of it wrong. She made coffee first. She always made coffee first. Then she pulled the radio's plug from the wall, because she liked the quiet, and dragged her stool close enough that her knees nearly touched the steel. The dial had frozen at 6 from 20 years of damp and rust. It would not turn, not with her fingers, not with a wrench wrapped in a rag to save the finish. She sprayed the mechanism with penetrating oil and waited, the smell of it thick and metallic in the small room. And while she waited, she sat with her hands folded and did not touch it again. 20 minutes. She had learned a long time ago that patience opened more locks than force ever had. The second attempt turned the dial a quarter inch. No more, a grinding sound like a knuckle popping. She oiled it again, then sat back on the stool and let the oil work while she checked, out of old habit, the little notebook where she'd logged every vault she'd opened before this one. None of them had sat closed as long as this. Her hands ached that evening the way they always did in cold weather. The old arthritis settling in her knuckles like a tenant that never paid rent, and twice she flexed her fingers and thought about quitting for the night. She thought, too, briefly, that she might have paid $60 for exactly what Pruett said she had, a rusted box with nothing behind it but pigeon droppings and a bad smell. She did not quit. Somewhere near 10, working the dial with the wrench wrapped in rag, she felt something give that hadn't given before, a looseness where there had only been resistance. She did not force it. She backed off, reapplied the oil a third time, and waited again, watching the small clock on the workbench shelf tick past 10:15, then 10:30, her back aching against the hard edge of the stool, her reading glasses fogged faintly from the heater's breath. The third attempt, past 9 o'clock, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and her back aching from the stool. The dial gave a half turn, then a full one, then stopped hard against something inside that had waited 20 years to stop. She heard the tumblers drop, for small clicks in a row, quieter than she expected, no bang at all, more like a man clearing his throat in another room. She did not open it right away. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the door for a long moment, the way she might look at a letter before deciding to read it. The rain had eased to a slow tick against the tin roof, and somewhere down the road a dog barked twice and went quiet, and Ruth thought, not for the first time that night, that a door like this one had spent 20 years holding its breath and deserved a moment before anyone made it let that breath go. The air that came out when she finally pulled the handle was cold, colder than the garage, and it smelled the way old paper smells, dry and a little sweet, mixed with something like machine oil, and underneath that faintly cedar. The first thing her hand found in the dark was the corner of a small tin box, cool and slightly gritty with rust dust, and she drew it toward the light with both hands because her fingers had gone stiff from the cold air and the cold night both. Inside the vault, behind the tin box, were 4 safe deposit boxes still sitting on their runners, untouched. Ruth worked slowly, laying each item on the workbench before she reached for the next. 3 war bonds, worth $18 apiece when they were bought in 1951, worth considerably more now, with interest that had never stopped accruing. A cloth bag of silver dollars, 41 of them, dated no later than 1949. A deed to a quarter section of land nobody in town remembered belonged to anyone living. Last was the tin box, and inside it, wrapped in waxed paper gone brittle and yellow, a letter. She unfolded it at the workbench under the bare bulb, her glasses down off her forehead now, and read it once through in silence, and then a second time, slower. It was addressed to a Miss Evelyn Voss, dated the 2nd of April, 1951, written in a hand that pressed hard enough to show through the paper. Daniel had written to his sister that he was putting money aside for her, that their mother's ring was in the box too, safe until he came home to give it to her the way he'd promised, that he didn't much like Korea and didn't plan on staying longer than the army made him. One line stood out from the rest, written smaller, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. "You keep the porch light on for me, Evie. I always know which house is ours by that light." The air that came out when she finally pulled the handle was cold, colder than the garage, and it smelled the way old paper smells, dry and a little sweet, mixed with something like machine oil, and underneath that faintly cedar. The first thing her hand found in the dark was the corner of a small tin box, cool and slightly gritty with rust dust, and she drew it toward the light with both hands because her fingers had gone stiff from the cold air and the cold night both. Inside the vault, behind the tin box, were 4 safe deposit boxes still sitting on their runners, untouched. Ruth worked slowly, laying each item on the workbench before she reached for the next. 3 war bonds, worth $18 apiece when they were bought in 1951, worth considerably more now, with interest that had never stopped accruing. A cloth bag of silver dollars, 41 of them, dated no later than 1949. A deed to a quarter section of land nobody in town remembered belonged to anyone living. Last was the tin box, and inside it, wrapped in wax paper gone brittle and yellow, a letter. She unfolded it at the workbench under the bare bulb, her glasses down off her forehead now, and read it once through in silence, and then a second time, slower. It was addressed to a Miss Evelyn Voss, dated the 2nd of April, 1951, written in a hand that pressed hard enough to show through the paper. Daniel had written to his sister that he was putting money aside for her, that their mother's ring was in the box too, safe until he came home to give it to her the way he'd promised, that he didn't much like Korea and didn't plan on staying longer than the army made him. One line stood out from the rest, written smaller, like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. You keep the porch light on for me, Evie. I always know which house is ours by that light. There was no ring in the box. Ruth searched twice and found none, and understood, without anyone telling her, that some promise made in that letter had gone unmet in more ways than one. She thought, for a moment, of her own husband's ring on the chain around her neck, and touched it once before letting her hand fall back to the bench. She folded the letter carefully along its old creases, the same folds it had worn for 20 years, and set it down. She did not cry. She sat on the stool with her hands flat on her knees and listened to the rain on the garage roof and the small tick of the space heater cooling, and she stayed that way for close to 10 minutes, not moving, not speaking, the letter sitting under the bulb's yellow light like it was still waiting on an answer. Then she got up, put the coffee pot back on the stove, and went to bed. She had learned that grief handled at midnight rarely comes out honest. Morning would keep it. She drove into town the next day at 7:15. Before the diner filled up, box wrapped in a towel on the truck seat beside her, and she left everything with the county clerk with no ceremony and almost no words. This belongs to Evelyn Voss, she said, if she's still living. She was 84 years old, in a rest home 40 minutes north in Alliance, still keeping, the staff there said, a small lamp lit in her window every night, though none of them had known why until that morning. Earl Pruett heard about it from the county clerk 2 days later, standing in the same lot where he'd laughed at $60. And by the account of the men who were there, he did not laugh this time. He asked what the bonds were worth with interest and was told a figure that made him go quiet for a good while. Within a year, his examiner's contract in that district was not renewed, after auditors found he'd been quietly steering the same failed bank salvage contracts to a cousin's firm in Lincoln. He had been wrong about the vault. He had not been wrong about much else in his life, people said, which was the closest thing to a kindness anyone in Millhaven offered him on his way out of town. Evelyn Voss received her brother's letter, the ring notwithstanding, on a Thursday afternoon in May, and she read it with a nurse standing by in case she needed help, though she did not. She kept the porch light burning every night for 11 more years, until she passed, not because she still expected her brother home, the nurse said, but because some habits outlive their reasons and become their own kind of faith. The vault door itself sits now in the front hall of the Colby County Historical Museum, 400-some pounds of gray steel behind a rope, a small brass plate below it reading only First Agricultural Bank, Millhaven, 1919. Children touch the dial on school trips and ask their teachers what it was for, and the teachers, most of them, tell it wrong. Say it was found full of gold, say it was some kind of treasure. Ruth never corrects them when she's there to hear it. Once, a boy of about 8 asked her directly what had really been inside, and she told him, plainly, a letter a soldier wrote to his sister and nothing more, and the boy seemed satisfied with that in a way the gold story never quite managed. She sold it to the museum for $1 and went back to restoring old fixtures the following Monday. Same as any other week. Her hands a little stiffer, her coffee a little cold by the time she remembered to drink it. She was offered a reward from the bond's matured value. She turned it down flat, said the money was Evelyn's and always had been, and would not discuss it further. Delbert Finn said later she'd have been embarrassed either way, taking it or being thanked for it, and that was likely true. She had never been offered a reward before that spring and would have been embarrassed by either the taking or the refusing said out loud. A man laughed at $60 once in a gravel lot, in front of a crowd that laughed because he did. A woman said nothing and drove 19 miles home in the rain and did the slow, unglamorous work of opening what he'd already decided was empty. What would you have done, standing in that crowd? Laugh along with the loud man or watch the quiet woman closest to the door? And what is still sitting locked in your own life, waiting on nothing more than someone patient enough to turn the dial?